Yo, word is up, everybody. I'm making a new tier list. My last one was not over, almost a year ago. And I said this. It's probably in like the Thunderfire burn range. It has some flaws where you do need to stick spirits on board. So that's not really accurate now, is it? Now, back almost a year ago, Thunder Nexus wasn't really being played yet. People just figured out what the deck was doing and that it could actually put up numbers. So it wasn't really refined. It was still getting there. It was honestly kind of bad at the time. But it got there. Now it's top tier. So we need to make a new tier list to kind of equate for the changes in play styles and how people play the game from almost over a year ago. And let's jump into that. Alright, so let's go over the tiers real quick. Tier 1 are going to be decks you will consistently see in those top cuts. They are decks with very few bad matchups and will consistently do well in a tournament, so you will see them consistently do well in placements and get to top cuts. Tier 2 are generally going to be decks that have poor matchups, strong combos that are difficult to pull off, or decks that have some glaring weakness in them that, although they do very well, they aren't consistent enough to consistently get to those top slots, so a tier 2 relegation. And then tier 3 are decks that kind of can surprise you, but generally won't pull ahead in any force anywhere, really. If they get to top cut, you'd be like, oh, that's really cool. I wouldn't expect that, but I could see how they got there. And then anything that's below that I didn't really add. And then I did get some decks that probably shouldn't be in tier 3 in this tier list just for some representation, because there's not a lot of representation in some elements. So let's jump into the tiers. Starting with Wind Burn. I'm going to put Wind Burn solid 2. Playing Exaltair, Aeolus, you're playing a Wind Toolbox, you're playing Eruptions. It's pretty solid. The big downside to it that makes it a little less consistent is it is expensive being a Wind Toolbox, and you're playing a lot of aggro cards, so you can get shut down by things like Tsunami and Shields. You can splash Matera into there, you can splash Stratomoth in there, but generally you're trying to go for more so aggressive plays and then try to close out the game with Exaltair and Eruptions. Kind of a Summer Winds V2, if you know what that means. Moving on, anything with Centaur. While Centaur wins you the game if you can get it out with September, it's not getting out at all ever easily, and you have to kind of get lucky with a good Chariot Ride, September combo to get it out and really hit hard with it. So it's generally tier 3. You could probably say it's even lower than that, but I did want to just give Earth a little bit more representation than the 2 decks it has. Next up, Volt Tempest. Right up in the tier 1. I do have this separate than Thunder Nexus because you do have to add those Griffuses or extra Volt Tempest to the deck that will reduce the consistency of the Thunder Nexus package, but the reduced consistency of that Thunder Nexus package increases your potential to just blow out your opponent really fast, really effectively with something that's very difficult to deal with. So it's a trade-off that makes the deck less consistent, but more easily able to blow out and win a game. Next up, we have Water Wind Counter Meta. So if you don't know what this deck is, generally a lot of Tsunamis are played and a lot of back row is played. So it's a water focused deck with some wind elements in there to deal with back row. In essence, to basically counter the meta, which I know what you're thinking, it's Thunder Nexus, right? No, the meta is counter runes. Everything else is second. So counter meta Water Wind is generally just trying to deal with that back row as efficiently and effectively as possible by just blowing it all away with Falcane, or just ignoring partial runes with like, oh, I don't care about your Tsunami. Sometimes they splash a Trident in there, but generally it just blows up back row, hits you with some really valuable 2-drops. Water Ramp, tier 3, similar to Centaur, it's a deck where when it sets up properly, it's really, really good. Like if you play a Majesty with a Trident and a Bag of Winds, which isn't that ridiculous to set up in some matchups, you can run away with the game. It's basically a Majesty that's almost impossible to be removed, but its inconsistency is the fact that you need multiple artifacts to make it work. Your draw engines sometimes don't work quite well, and you're playing a focused water deck, which focused water isn't that great. Up next, we're going to put the Bears. I'm going to put this a little bit higher on the tier 3 list because you can run the Cubs with another value package, which we've seen be very successful in the past with a Bears Nexus and a Bears Trident deck. But Bears on their own as a deck archetype isn't good enough. But I did want to mention Bears because if you mix Bears well with another element and deck, the bears do give you some good value engine stuff to kind of stick your board and keep you going with certain matchups. Thunder Nexus, that is currently the boogeyman of the deck. The deck in the format generally right now, partially in the back, that Spark at turn 1 is very difficult to deal with. Nothing crazy otherwise, it's just a very much, if you play Magic the Gathering, it's a Jund out style where you're just going to outvalue your opponent slowly over time. The big issue is that Spark at turn 1, which is devastating. Spark it wouldn't be as ridiculous if you couldn't use it turn 1, but you can, so it's really good. Moving on, we have Earth Beaters. I'm actually going to put this ahead of Volt Tempest because it's extremely consistent. It's really hard, is one of the widest decks in the top tier. You can go like Viserys super wide, Tectorus, drop more Tectoruses, really get big on the deck. So you have a lot of really strong creatures that don't really get outed by Zeus effectively from Thunder Nexus. And generally, once you trigger your Helios Chariot Ride, you can pretty much board wipe, knock out your opponent, play all your counters still with the deck, get big, strong bodies without needing to use a Zeus to get over things. Really powerful in that way. There are lots of more independently powerful cards as opposed to Thunder Nexus working together very well. So Earth Beaters, I think, is up there, and we saw it second place in the last tournament. I'm filming this right before the third constructed tournament, so we'll see how much this all gets upended. And then the next deck, Fire in general. I just wanted to give Fire more representation in this list, and generally Fire is really bad. If you are playing Fire as a main core strategy, you're generally doing a Helios Chariot Ride and Blazerus kind of thing, where you're trying to just hit really hard with Blazerus. In theory, we have found OTKs with Blazerus and stuff, but you're generally not OTKing, and I just want to give Fire representation. It's the only reason it's here. Otherwise, I would relegate it to a lower tier. And then the last of the tier 1 decks I'm going to put up here, I'm going to put Five Guys. So Five Guys is in the name, it's 5 attack bodies. The whole deck strategy is to just aggressively drop attacker after attacker after attacker after attacker. So you're not trying to blow up back row, you're not trying to disrupt back row, you're just trying to run into their back row so much that they just can't stop all of the pressure. Your thing gets shielded, okay cool, I'll play my 5 attack back down. Your thing gets poison tipped arrow, okay I have another 5 attack ready to go. It's just consistent attrition over and over and over again, and that's what the deck runs. It uses Viserys to go a little wide sometimes to get Necro for extra damage, Charlotte for that manipulation. Galaxy is a little bit of manipulation and water anti-tsunami tech, so it does a little bit of everything, and it just hits the ground, hits the ground, hits the ground, hits the ground, and you're just trying to basically outvalue your opponent's removal options by just dropping attackers turn after turn after turn after turn. Alright, I'm going to put this next deck into tier 2, Sonicor Floats. So we actually saw this deck do pretty well, I forget which tournament off the top of my head, but it did get top cut, and it's generally a defensive water deck that floats into Sonicor by using Foamy or Mestation to just be defensive turn 1, drop a Sonicor turn 2, and just start swinging with Sonicors. A few other tech cards, it's got Galaxies, it gets access to Tsunami and Element, stuff like that. Solid deck overall, a little bit of a mid-rangey, just gets on the core out, beat over counter runes because again, as I said before, counter runes are the meta. Alright, next up, my favorite pet deck is going to be Fruit. So there's 2 variants of Fruit that are pretty common. There's like a mid-range version where you run Viserys, Equilinx, Demeter, and then Lotagon, Drataya, a couple other cards. And then there's more of the control variant where you really go with like spin inf, defensive bodies, trying to collect all your fruit pieces to just combo in one big turn. The mid-range version is generally a bit better, it's easier to play, where the combo version is probably the only deck in the format that can board wipe consistently. It's a solid tier 2. It's a little bit hard of a deck to play because you have to balance, do I want to disrupt my opponent's hand with Apple now? Do I want to wait for Lotagon? Do I use my Ambrosia now? Do I want to wait for Drataya? There's a lot of options to think about. It's a really fun deck. It's my favorite deck. And it's a solid like middle of the road tier 2. Krakatuga Burn. I'm going to put this also kind of middle of the road tier 2. It's another deck that did pretty well in the first tournament actually. And it can really surprise people with a lot of damage. Where you play either Foamy into Krakatuga or Tadpuff Krakatuga. Use Krakatuga to burn for 3. play Eruption, burn for another 3, that's 6 damage right there. Pop a card on your opponent's board, and then if they use, say, Earthquake to answer your Krakatuga, you just use 3 to 5 spirits to deal almost 8 damage to your opponent. Potentially do it again the next turn. So if they don't have the answer to Krakatuga right away, Krakatuga kind of has the same situation with Vault, where it doesn't need to attack into your shields to hit your opponent to deal damage. And that's pretty powerful. Not a ton of Vertaquas are played to counter it, not a ton of like Boombats and other cards, so generally Earthquake is the threat to it. Dodge Earthquake, play Krakatuga, blow up your opponent. It's a really good deck that way. Next up, your General Wind Toolbox. Pretty strong, solid tier 2 deck. It is a little expensive, which is the issue, and it can get sideboarded against really easily with Pandora's Box and Gorgons shutting down the core of the deck. I think it's probably going to be best tier 2 deck. Again, it will shine in game 1, giving you access to all your cards pretty consistently, but again, it dies to Pandora's Boxes and Gorgons pretty consistently. You're loading up a lot of spirits on board with Aeolus, so you're basically just asking to get roiled, but it's a good deck otherwise. It's got some flaws, but it's got really crazy strength to counteract those flaws. And last but not least, I'm going to put Trident Poseidon decks, any lock deck. So generally top decks aren't, TOPP decks, I guess the better say to say it, not top decks, aren't a deck archetype on their own, but there's a lot of versions of what you run to give the Trident Poseidon combo 2. I mentioned earlier you could do a bear version of it, you can do a Thunder Nexus version of it, you can do a 5 guys, an Earth Beater version of it. It's generally, the deck archetype is you're trying to do Trident, it's just what you're tridenting in, and there's pros and cons to a lot of things, but I do want to mention it is a solid deck because, again, what is the meta? Counter runes. What are we countering? Counter runes with Trident Poseidon combo. So I want to put it, I think, solid tier 2. It really depends on what you're adding to it to make it work best, but it's very good. So that is basically the tier list I have that I put in. I think a lot of people kind of be on the same page. I know some people probably will put Earth Beaters and 5 guys lower than Thunder Nexus and Vault Tempest, but those decks I think really do match up pretty well against Thunder Nexus decks, giving the constant pressure to them. They don't care about getting hand ripped as much because they have a lot more value 1-drops to play than just a couple important pieces. So yeah, that is my deck list for today. I think it's a lot more clear and concise than the last one I did. No more mistakes with that Thunder Nexus comment, and see you guys in the next one. You have a great one.